Welcome to today's discussion. My name is Glenn Deason. I'm joined by Alexander Mercurs from the Duran, and the guest today is Geoffrey Roberts, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of College Cork. It's great to see you both again.
Hi, Glenn and Alexander.
Mm-hmm. So our topic today will be the use of history in politics, both authentic and misrepresentation, of course. I think a nice quote I always like is George Orwell's in 1984. He wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future." I think it's a good quote outlining the imperative of using history for politics, as well. Those who control the historical narrative often have the ability to also influence the present and the future. However, as we always see, manipulating history also comes at a huge cost because it undermines our ability to have a common understanding of the past, to live in the same reality. And of course, we're also less able to draw on the conclusions of history to inform the present. So I think that the use of history is especially important to understand the relations between the West and Russia, because often it seems we do live in two very different worlds, which can have its root in two different narratives of history. I tend to see this as being very much front and center of tensions. For example, briefly, I would just say, to understand the conflict between the West and Russia, I often ask my students a very simple question, which everyone, ideally would have the same answer to, which is, when did the Cold War end, for example? Because I often find that whenever people say, oh, it's 1989, when Bush and Gorbachev declared an end to the Cold War, and we reached an agreement the year after, the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, outlining inclusive European security architecture without dividing lines. This is one historical narrative. Then the other one will be, other part of the class will say, no, it ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And from there on, you can already map out how history shapes the present, because, again, obviously, if it was in 1989 through compromise and negotiations, then, NATO expansion represent this enormous betrayal that would revive the Cold War, as argued by George Kennan. However, if NATO expansion ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then NATO expansion could represent the right of the victor, and Russia's resistance or complaints could be dismissed as a revisionist effort to undermine the post-Cold War system. So I think these are important issues, because we also then address topics such as what's the path to peace. If it's 1991, it's through victory. If it's 1989, it's through diplomacy. So I think that this makes it very important to understand where the historical narrative of the other side comes from. Which is also why I keep pointing out it's very unfortunate that we seem to have trained the population to scream Russian propaganda every time they present vision of a history which differs from what we have been served. Anyways, as we will discuss today, I think also the proxy war we are now fighting in Ukraine also has an important historical component to it, in which both sides lean on two different historical narratives. So in order to understand history and how it's used, this is why we invited the great Geoffrey Roberts, a leading historian on Russian and Soviet policies. So I thought we can start off by addressing Russia's historical narrative, if they're substantiated by facts, but also how they're used, and especially Putin, which most of his speeches and articles appears to lean heavily into history. I guess more recently, at least over the past 2 years, we see Putin being quite critical of Lenin, especially the transfer of Russian territories to the administrative borders of Ukraine within the Soviet Union, of course. So let's fact check him, if you will, Putin's understanding of history. Let's just start off this as a point of departure. So Professor Roberts, how do you see this? What is Putin's argument about all critical arguments about Lenin, and how do you see this being substantiated by facts?
Okay, well, let me begin by yes, making this point, obvious point, is that Putin has a passion for history. Yeah, in terms of his pastime reading, he reads history and he reads literature, and his kind of speeches are full of kind of historical references and claims, lessons he's learned from history. He's written two, both published in the last couple of years, in fact, two major historical essays. One on this famous and now notorious essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Although at the time he gave it wasn't that notorious, because 40% of Ukrainians, it seems, actually agreed with him in July 2021. And then the other essay was an essay on the origins of the Second World War. And he's also made a number of other notable speeches in which there's a very, very strong historical content, particularly on anniversary dates, anniversaries in relation to the Second World War. But I think there's another important point to make about Putin. Okay, so he's a politician, and his history, as presented in his essays and in his speeches, is a politicized history, in a sense that it has a political purpose in the present. He doesn't write history just for the sake of it. Yeah. So there's always and the political purpose is transparent. It's obvious. And he actually states it, what he's actually saying in his essays or in his speeches. So there's no secret about it. There's no hidden kind of agenda. But at the same time, Putin is also very, very insistent on getting the record straight about the truth about the past. Putin is not a postmodernist. Yeah, he believes, and I think this is where his legal background comes into it. He believes in evidence. He believes in the importance of getting the narrative straight. He believes there is one truth, and he believes it should be a shared and common truth. Because if you have these competing truths, then you have a situation of conflict, and of course, it's very much what we can see in relation to the Ukraine war. So Putin's defense and emphasis on of historical methodology, traditional historical methodology, I find quite striking. Yeah. Okay. Now, more direct response to your question. Yeah. So the other thing to say is, okay, he reads a lot of history. He's very interested. He has interesting things to say about history. These essays he wrote, as a historian, I would assess as being pretty good essays. But Putin is not an original thinker. Yeah, he's not what you read in those essays are some very, very common themes of what I would call post-Soviet historiography. That's to say, historiography which has its roots in the Soviet period, but has also developed in the post-Soviet context, when there's a lot more freedom of thought and there's no party line to adhere to, and so on. But so he's interesting, but he's not. He's not. And obviously, it's obviously significant. But it's not original. That's important. But there's one respect in which I won't say he's original, but there's a kind of peculiarity of what he has to say about history in relation to Ukraine. Is his animus towards Lenin. Okay, so Putin is a conservative, now a conservative. He doesn't have a very good view of the Bolsheviks or of the Russian the Bolshevik Party. He sees that as being a disaster for Russia. He approves of the overthrow of Tsardom and democratic Russia in 1917, but he disagrees with the Bolshevik seizure of power, which of course led to the Civil War and all kinds of other kind of complications as well. So obviously there's an obvious political reason why he would have this animus towards Lenin, but he also has this particular thing about blaming Lenin for, at least to a certain extent, for the current set of problems in relation to Ukraine, which Putin sees historically as arising, at least in part, out of the fact that a lot of Russian lands and a lot of Russian peoples were included as part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the early 1920s. And then subsequent to that, other bits of territory were added to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, right? And those like boundaries were the ones that remained in place in 1991 when the USSR collapsed. So Putin's always criticizing Lenin's giveaway of Russian lands to the Ukrainians in the early 1920s. But he never actually explains why Lenin and the Bolsheviks did that. And by the way, I don't think Lenin was particularly culpable in this respect, but he was the head of the government. Yeah, sure. He takes responsibility. But Putin never explains why Lenin and the Bolsheviks did this. And actually, they had some good reasons for doing it, right? And one of the primary reasons was that in these historical Russian lands, Novorossiya and Mala Russe, all that kind of thing, there were a lot of Ukrainians. They were ethnically mixed lands. Lots of Ukrainians. Ukrainian historians would claim there were a majority of Ukrainians in these territories, which became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I'm not quite so convinced by that, but certainly there was a lot of Ukrainians. And the further west you went, the more Ukrainians there were. And the more people speaking Ukrainian or speaking dialects of Russian rather than Russian. So there were good ethno-linguistic reasons for actually including these territories into the Ukrainian Republic, Soviet Socialist Republic. But the other thing is that the Bolsheviks wanted to create a strong socialist Soviet Ukraine that would be a strong counter to Ukrainian nationalism, which was still active within the boundaries within the Soviet Union itself, but also were establishing themselves a base in Galicia, Eastern Galicia, we call it Western Ukraine broadly, which as a result of the Civil War and the Russo-Polish War had become occupied by the Poles in 1920, right? And Ukrainian nationalists were using that as their base for their nationalist agitation, and the Poles actually were encouraging them because they had this animus towards the Bolsheviks as well. So it is to create a strong political counter to Ukrainian nationalism. And then the third thing was, and I think this particularly applies to the reason why the Donbass was included in Ukraine, which was very heavily Russian compared to other areas which became part of Ukraine, because the Donbass was an industrial area, the mines and so on. And of course, it was in the industrial areas, the urban areas, that's where the Bolshevik political base was. So it was very much a political calculation there as well. And the other thing I kind of make about it is that it didn't work out too badly until 2014. Because after the Soviet collapse, because of the way Ukraine had been constructed historically, including by this transfer of historical Russian lands to the Ukrainian Republic by Lenin, there was a certain balance in Ukraine. Yes. A balance between the Western and the Eastern orientation, between the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers, between the ultra-Ukrainian nationalists and other Ukrainians who weren't so nationalist and wanted to continue to have a good relationship with Russia. And that balance was maintained until it was overthrown, of course, by the Maidan events, which led to Crimea's secession and then to the secession of the Donbass. And once you get to that situation, of course, the Ukrainian nationalist element, not just in Western Ukraine and Galicia, but also in central and southern Ukraine, becomes very, very predominant, dominant politically, and is able to pursue its policy of trying to suppress the Donbass secession by force of arms. And of course, that's where the whole crisis begins, and it culminates. Well, and it's ongoing, of course, in this current war. So I think Putin's a little bit unfair on Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Yeah, but the interesting thing about that, though, is I'm sorry. I think he's unfair on Lenin, and I'm contesting the details of what he's saying. But it's interesting that at the same time, Putin is striving to have a long-term perspective. of what's going on. He's striving to have a historical view, and he's striving for that historical view to inform his present day understandings and his present day action. And that's all to the good, I think, providing that the historical view you have is not distorted, it's not misrepresented, it doesn't misrepresent things, and because as long as it's like a good history, and in general, I think Putin's perspective is reasonably good history, but in this particular instance, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental point because, of course, you can have different historical perspectives of particular events. What becomes, I think, a bit concerning is when those perspectives, a particular perspective, one perspective, becomes a kind of state dogma. And, I have been following a lot of Russian commentary recently about the war. And of course, because Putin is the president of Russia, because what he's been writing about the origins of today's Ukraine, the events of the 1920s, the decisions that were made then, the decisions that were made in the 1930s, because he's writing them, and because he's the president of Russia, and because he is the leader of Russia at a time of war, these views are being reproduced by more and more people in Russia. And they are being taken straightforwardly as an unchallengeable, incontrovertible truth. That this is a decision that was made by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. It's often explained as a particular animus that Lenin himself is supposed to have had against Russia, that he did this in order to weaken Russia itself. And you can find some of this appearing in some of the things even that Putin sometimes hints at. And that essentially what is being done today is correcting the mistakes that Lenin made in the 1920s. And of course, that in turn has that translates into a new perspective about how Russia should be developed from this point onwards, that it should become a much more consciously, conservative, orthodox, national state than it has historically been, which is, of course, can I quickly say, paradoxical, because Putin, at the same time as he's expressing all these views about what Lenin did in the 1920s, goes out of his way continuously to say that Russia is, in fact, a multinational, multi-ethnic state. And he also speaks about Ukrainians and Russians as being branches of the same tree, that even he's now coming close to saying that they are connected people. So this is an example, I think, of where his criticisms of Lenin, they're becoming very, very pointed, and they're becoming very widely repeated, are not only having an effect on the internal political debate in Russia, but they're doing so in ways which perhaps he himself might not ultimately approve.
Because Putin's position, I think, is that the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are one people. Yeah, not just they're part of one big Russian family, which kind of historically is a narrative that begins to develop. I think it's in the latter part of the 17th century, when significant parts of what we now know as Ukraine become part of the Russian Empire. Right. So this narrative of one people. Yeah, common heritage and all that, going back to Kiev and Russe, yes, the first Russian state and so on, is all part of a kind of like a Tsarist state and nation building project. Yes, we are this one people. That's part of the foundation of our strength, and and it's not just the Russians that form the core of the Russian multinational and Soviet multinational and post-Soviet national state. It's the Ukrainians and the Belarusians as well. Okay, then what happens is that in the 19th century in Ukraine, as across Europe, of course, you get the development of nationalist movements, nationalist ideologies, nationalist historians, right, who create a counter narrative to the one people narrative, and their narrative. I'm not sure it's two peoples, but certainly in their narrative is that the Ukrainians, those speaking Ukrainian in Galicia and so on, that they're a distinct and separate branch of the Eastern Slavonic family, and of course that's the foundation of the claim for national independence for Ukraine. Now, in terms of Lenin, Lenin, I don't think Lenin didn't have any animus towards the Russians. No, he was Russian himself. I think he was proud of that. What he had in animus towards was great Russian national chauvinism. Yeah, that's why he didn't like Russian. But also, Lenin had no truck with Ukrainian nationalism either, and even less so did Stalin. Stalin, very active in repressing Ukrainian nationalism over many decades. Okay, so so the Soviets had this multinational policy, which basically encouraged cultural nationalism, but suppressed political nationalism. Yeah, there was never any question of any. Okay, the Ukraine, like all the other republics, had the right to secede. They had like the sovereign right to secede, but there was never any question of that actually being actualized in practice. Right? That politics was off the agenda, but there could be cultural nationalism, and the Bolsheviks encouraged it, facilitated. In Ukraine, they had what Ukrainianization. Yeah, spreading the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian speakers being put into key positions. Ukrainian actually being taught in Russian schools as well as in Ukrainian massive kind of like program of Ukrainianization, which of course has the effect historically of forming the foundation for Ukrainian nationalism as it reemerges in the Second World War in the first instance, and then of course in the post in the post-Soviet period. But going back to this question about you were saying about Russian nationalists. Their particular kind of view, which is to a certain extent articulated by Putin, about these historical Russian lands, and we need to reunify them. They need to return to the greater Russian family, become part of Russia basically. Is what I don't take into account is that they were historical Russian lands, but in the meantime, a lot of things happened in Ukraine. You had the development of a separate Ukrainian culture and nationalism in the form of Galicia when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then also we had nearly 100 years we've had of Ukraine being either a Soviet republic, socialist republic, or independent Ukraine, and a lot of stuff has happened. During that 100-year period, in particular, the language has spread, the culture has spread, perceptions of difference have spread. There's been a certain distancing by some sections of the Ukrainian population, large sections, increasingly large sections, from Russia. So your perspective on Russia's historical lands and territories and how you relate to them, I think, has to take that reality into account. And what I would say is that at the present time, if you're talking about Russian-speaking and pro-Russian areas of Ukraine, I would say that the territories, the provinces, the oblasts, which Russia has already incorporated, Crimea plus Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Lugansk and Donetsk, those are the most pro-Russian, Russian identifying areas of Ukraine, right? And the further west you go, the less pro-Russian, less Russian speakers, the more Ukrainian, the more nationalist orientation is going to get. Now, there may be good reasons for expanding in that direction, military reasons, but I think there needs to be a bit of reality about what's going to happen, what's going to be the consequences of that, and it's not going to be so easy to incorporate. I think that the Russians can manage the incorporation of what they've already incorporated, but they go much beyond that. I mean, apart from the difficulties of actually, capturing and occupying these territories and sustaining occupation, I think they're going to run into great difficulties about, integrating them into the Russian Federation. And if you're not going to do that, proper full integration, then I'm not sure you should be going there at all. At least in terms of direct territorial expansion. And the other point I make is that one needs to take into account external perceptions of what's going on here, or what might go on here. At the moment, Russia has quite a lot of allies, partners, supporters in the so-called global South, who understand the Russian position, understand why Putin has done what it's done. I actually understand that why there's been this territory expansion into the Donbass and into the Black Sea coastlands, and they're prepared to accept that as part of a peace deal of some kind. But the more Russia expands territory, the more annexations, if you can call it that, it carries out. I think the less understanding there's going to be for Russia's actions in the global South, and the more isolated Russia might find itself internationally, and also that kind of expansion, will I would say almost throw a lifeline for the credibility of the West and NATO and Ukrainian nationalism, because they'll be able to say, well, you said that Putin's ambitions were limited, the security, defense, and they were just like, but look what's happened. He's conquering the whole of Ukraine. He's claiming it's part, or it's historical Russia, but actually that's not actually true. So I'm kind of worried about how sometimes historical discourses, rhetoric, can actually build up a kind of momentum which almost becomes kind of unstoppable. I don't think Putin has crossed the Rubicon in that respect. I think his position is restrained, and he's keeping his options open. But certainly, even his drift, it is in that direction that we need to reoccupy these territories and these peoples that were formerly part of Russia.
The Kievan Rus is really the center, it feels, in terms of the challenges, if you will, about creating a Ukrainian national identity. Because again, when Putin refers to Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians as one people, obviously it's a reference to Kievan Rus from millennia ago. And of course, I can understand the concerns for Ukrainian nationalists, what this means, because if you recognize this history that they were all part of Kievan Rus, then they fragmented into now 3 different nations. It's almost as if the natural condition would be for them to reunite. So again, this is what I often read from Ukrainian authors, which is this would normalize empire, if you will. So they're very strict, strong against this. But again, then they have to find a way of using history to reject this whole notion that they are all part of Kievan Rus, that they're all, again, one people from this sense. And that's when you get this obsession often, I think, from Ukrainians, nationalists, where they insist that, they monopolize on Kievan Rus, that, they are the real successors. So then they have to explain the Russians. Well, who are the Russians if they're not a common people from Kievan Rus? And then they always return back to this idea that they're the successor of the Mongols. They are these barbarians from the east. They're not even Europeans; they're Asians who came in. This is the barbarians at the gate, and then you see the attempt to differentiate themselves from Russia becomes effectively a very anti-Russian, aggressive anti-Russian position, which can also be cultivated by others in the West, especially the United States, if they want to convert Ukraine into an anti-Russian front line. And I guess this is also why Putin also focuses a lot on Kievan Rus, because he feels this is what the West is doing by trying to rehabilitate, if you will, the Bandera legacy, because exactly because of this Ukrainian nationalism. Well, I think was a good reason why the Ukrainian nationalists aligned themselves with Hitler in the Second World War in order to well, essentially rid themselves of this Russian legacy. But again, that's why I'm a little bit concerned now as well when I see the current policies, because in the past, I felt at least Europeans were a bit cautious about stoking some of the more dangerous historical narratives. For example, suggesting that Holodomor was deliberate genocide against the Ukrainians, as opposed to being a famine, which also affected Russians and Kazakhs. And as also Bandera, of course, making him a national hero to organize national identity around. This is something that really, really infuriates the Russians, because now you don't have a distinctive Ukrainian national identity. Now you have an anti-Russian one, where they actually celebrate a Nazi collaborator. And so when I see the EU Parliament, they're all yelling, "Slava Ukraini," which is a slogan of the OUN and the fascists. Obviously, this is something in which the Russians see less and less ability to even have proper diplomacy anymore. So I was just wondering if you can, speak of how you see this, the legacy of Kiev and Rus. Is it really important to understand the current tensions, or is it more disappears in the background? Is it more the Second World War issues that pop up?
I agree with everything you just said there, Glenn. I might be wrong about this, but my understanding is that the one people notion also originally included the Galicians, the Western Ukraine and the Ukrainian speaking sections of Ukraine. It wasn't just Ukrainians who speak Russian or no. It was, but that seems to have shifted. So what Putin seems to be saying now, isn't it? He seems to be saying that he seems to be writing off Western Ukraine, Galicia, Lvov, and all that as being something other, no longer part of the Russian family, and he's happy for Poland, the West, to do whatever they want, whatever they want with that. Now, I mean, that I find that worrying for two reasons. One is because it implies that the implication is he's not said this, and he's kept his options open, that we're going to take all the rest. Certainly up to Dnieper, and probably, by implication, Kiev itself, which will be an enormous undertaking, very costly, damaging, dangerous, all this kind of things. So that kind of worries me. But the other thing that worries me is that it kind of like it kind of by excluding Western Ukraine in the way in which it does, and characterizing in which that as being like Banderites and stuff like this. Yes. It kind of plays into the hands of ultra Ukrainian nationalism, doesn't it? And also into the hands of Western ultras who want to stoke up those kind of tensions and those kind of differences, right? And want to go along with this idea that that on the other side of the Dnieper anyway, that's the land of the barbarians, of the Russians, and Western Ukraine, Galicia, is naturally a part of the West. So it's very divisive kind of discourse that has grown up, which could have negative consequences. And as I say, I'm kind of concerned about how it kind of like feeds into the ultra nationalist Ukrainian narrative itself.
Because Putin is now actually straightforwardly, I mean, he's quoting, there's a comment made by an MP of the Tsarist Duma that, if you want to lose Ukraine, then annex Galicia. He's talking about Galicia increasingly as being this big mistake that Stalin made in 1939. Bringing Galicia into the Soviet Union was a terrible mistake. It was taking territory away from Poland and Hungary and Romania, and this is another, on top of Lenin's mistakes in the 1920s of giving the Russian lands to Ukraine. The other great mistake was Stalin's decision in 1939 to advance into Galicia and to reincorporate it in the Soviet Union. And this isn't even, according to him, Ukrainian territory anymore. I mean, his latest speech, the one I think that he made to the Defense Ministry board, he actually said that he knows 100% that the people in this region want to join Poland again, which I think, I mean, I have seen no evidence for that claim at all, and he didn't provide any. But he is increasingly making this distinction between, Galicia and the rest of Ukraine, and is implying that this is all a terrible mistake and that it was warned about before the First World War, and that Stalin went there and seized all these lands. And again, Stalin did this for some incomprehensible reason, known best to himself, which Putin never discusses.
Yeah. Actually, Putin has a lot more time for Stalin than he does for Lenin, because he sees Stalin as a state builder, yes, and a unifier, and a centralizer. So there is that. But yeah, you're right. He does criticize Stalin in relation to the Soviet acquisition of Western Ukraine from 1939 onwards. But as you say, it doesn't actually explain what went on there. Well, for a start, okay, some of this territory, some of Western Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Other parts of it were parts of the Russian Empire. And what happened was, as a result of Poland's victory in the Russo-Polish War, 1919-1920, and the Treaty of Riga, 1921, I think it was, is that the Bolsheviks were forced to concede Western Ukraine to Poland, yeah, and also the same applied to Western Belarus as well. Okay, so it was occupied by Poland. It was known as Poland's Eastern Territories. The Poles, of course, thought they had a special historical claim for it. From their point of view, Lvov or Lviv, I'm not sure what do they call it, was a Polish city, and to a certain extent, they were right. It was a historically Polish city, but all the peasants living around it, the rest of the area were actually Ukrainians, not Poles, or they were Jewish. Yes, that was the other major nationality there. So then we come to the Nazis, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and there is this spheres of influence arrangement, August 1939, and then what people don't also know is that subsequent to the first spheres of influence arrangement, there was a second spheres of influence arrangement in September. There was a friendship and boundary treaty, which basically fixed Soviet acquisitions in eastern Poland along the so-called Curzon line. Yeah, Lord Curzon, British Foreign Secretary at the time of the Versailles Peace Conference, and he chaired a committee or a commission which was looking into what should be the boundary between Russia and Poland. Because Poland, of course, re-emerged as an independent state, but what should be its boundary? And the line that the frontier it came up with became known as the Curzon line, which is supposedly the fairest ethnographical division between Russia and Poland. So when Stalin is acquiring Western Ukraine in 1939, he's just like doing something that the Bolsheviks always intended to do, because they'd lost that territory to Poland by force, and also something that people in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian Soviet Social Union, that's what they wanted to happen. They wanted that. There was huge popular enthusiasm for that reunification process, and the same applied to Belarus as well. So that's what happens. Of course, later on, the territory is lost to the Germans and so on. But throughout the Second World War, Stalin is insistent that that 1939 border with Poland, which ran along more or less, not completely, there were some differences, the Curzon line, that would be the post-Second World War frontier between Poland and the USSR. So from Stalin's point of view, it wasn't really about Ukraine. That was a done deal. Obviously, Ukraine was seen as being one entity. Okay, they spoke Ukrainian or more Ukrainian in Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine than they did in the East, but it was still seen as being a unified territory. It was never an issue. So the whole thing about Ukraine's western frontier, as we now know it, wasn't about what Ukraine's western frontier was really. It was about the frontier between the USSR and Poland. That's what it was. What it was all about. So when Putin complains about the arbitrariness with which modern Ukraine's borders are constructed, yeah, he kind of has a point. There is a certain arbitrary quality to it, but not completely. Yeah, I would say that the only really kind of like arbitrary decision in relation to Ukraine's borders was the one in 1954, the transfer by Khrushchev to the Crimea. That's all the rest of it. Actually, is when you look at it in detail, is quite organic and makes a lot of sense. And only in retrospect is it seen to be arbitrary and administrative. That wasn't the way it was seen at the time.
I wanted to ask you, well, almost touched on it, which is the divisions we've had over the Second World War as well, because of course the Russians use history for politics, but this is also true of us in the West, of course. And I guess one thing that really been standing out in the past few years is, at least the past 10 years, if not 15, has been the efforts in the European Union to blame the Second World War on the pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, so the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So that the argument being, was I guess a way of suggesting that the Second World War was really a conflict against the totalitarians, in which instead of having the Soviet Union as the main actor who defeated Nazi Germany, I guess you would know better, but I think about 85% of the German casualties occurred on the East Front. So instead of having the Soviet Union in partnership with the West defeating Nazi Germany, there's been this effort to put the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in one category, referring to totalitarianism in terms of linking them. But to that end, you see that the efforts to suggest that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is what really triggered the Second World War is something, went a little bit from the periphery, and now it's in the center, to the extent that the European Union is pushing this very hard with its declarations that this is a time to remember the victims of totalitarianism, essentially, and also blaming both of these countries for the war. I was just wondering, what are your historical perspective on this? Was this in a vacuum, or did other countries make deals with Hitler? How do you see the relevance of what would be the different variables triggering the Second World War, and what is the role of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact?
Well, of course, I've written many books and articles about all of these topics, Glenn. So
which is why I
could keep you here all afternoon or all night, forevermore, talking about these topics. But I'm not going to do that. But it's the important point you raised, because of course it was that historical revisionism, revising the Second World War as not being an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi war, an anti-Hitler war, but being a war against Soviet totalitarianism, whereas Nazi totalitarianism, and sidelining and denying the role that the Soviet Union played and sacrifices it made in the victory over Nazi Germany. I mean, it was the emergence of that historical revisionism in the 2000s, yes, particularly in the EU context. That is what actually drew Putin into history and historical research, and started to really engage with documents, facts, arguments, the literature, and so on. Right. So in 2009, was that the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the war? No, I think I'm right. I must say that 70th the anniversary. Yeah, he was in Poland for those commemorations, right? And he made a very notable speech there, and he also published an article in Polish on the anniversary of the war. And in both the speech and the article, he pushed back against this historical revision quite explicitly. He did, and he contested the idea that the Second World War was triggered by the Nazi-Soviet Pact. He said no, it was true. If there was, it was okay. The Nazi-Soviet Pact played a role in the outbreak of war, but what about the Munich Agreement, right? And he also pointed out that throughout the 1930s, the Soviet Union was striving for a collective security arrangements, particularly with Britain and France, to actually stop Hitler, to avert war. And of course, he also points out that when the Soviet Union does get involved in the war, it's the Soviet Union that actually bears the main brunt of the fighting on the Allied side. But also, he also made the point that at the same time, the anti-Hitler coalition, the Grand Alliance, was very, very important. And the Soviet Union during the war had huge support from its Western allies. So he pushes back very strongly against this historical revisionism that's becoming more and more prevalent. But at the same time, it's quite a conciliatory speech and a conciliatory article, because what he's saying is, look, we can disagree about these things. As long as we can agree on some basic facts and context of the whole thing, we can have different kind of evaluations, right? But that shouldn't blind us to the main lesson of the war. And the main lesson of the war was that was not he says this in the article. I think it's not 1939 that we need to focus on so much. It's not that anniversary. The really important anniversary is 1945, when we secured this common victory over Nazi Germany, and we saved Europe and the whole world from Nazism. That's what we ought to commemorate and celebrate, and that should be the foundation of our relations. And the other things in relation to how the Second World War came about, who was to blame for this, who was to blame for that, that's of a secondary character. Yeah, so it's this whole debate about the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the war origins. That's what engages Putin with history as an active participant in the discussion, right? And then 10 years later, he kind of like the 80th anniversary, he gets involved again, and he makes many similar arguments, but he takes a much kind of like more strident, much more hardline view in 2019 and 2020 than he did 10 years previously. And that's partly because for the previous 10 years, there have been this historical revisions have been growing and growing and getting more vociferous and actually that's a lot more nasty, right? So and Soviet Union, Russia, Stalin being demonized by these anti-Russophobic kind of elements. So it's not surprising that he puts a hard line face. And from those sets of interventions, then, of course, we get to the big essay that he publishes on the origins of the Second World War. That's in 221, and then also, his historical interest then spread out into doing this more broader historical article on the historical. On the unity of the Russian Ukrainian people. Yeah, so that whole debate is actually quite crucial. Can I just make one general point about Putin's relationship to history and the role that it plays in shaping his thinking and action? Okay, because I suppose I haven't got a copy to hand. But I was going to say my latest book, Stalin's Library, a dictator in his books. In fact, I'll go and get a copy when you're speaking, Alexander. Obviously, that was a question that I had to deal with in relation to Stalin, because Stalin, of course, was a history buff as well, probably more so than Putin. Well, maybe not, but anyway, but that'd be a big history buff, but also a big literature buff. A lot of things in common between Stalin and Putin as readers. And Stalin had lots of things to say about history, particularly Russian history, of course. So in research for that, but I'm saying, well, how do I weigh the importance? How do I characterize the importance? As I was saying, my latest book, Stalin's Library, a dictator in his books. One of its major themes is Stalin's love of history and how history informed his outlook and his policies and action. So this kind of like passion for history was something that Putin shares with Stalin. So I had to, what was Stalin's relationship to history, historical knowledge, and what he got from reading history books? How did that impact on his policies, his decisions, and actions? And okay, and you can ask the same question in relation to Putin as well. And there's lots of people who they try to like read off directly from Putin's supposed views about history and read that into his action and decision. So some people say, "Oh, Putin doesn't believe Ukraine's a real country, a real nation, so that's why it's okay for him to invade it." Or Putin. Some people say, "Oh, Putin thinks the Soviet, Russian Empire, Soviet Empire was a good thing, so he wants to, he wants to recruit it." Things like that. Okay, so what the conclusion I came to in relation to Stalin, and I think it applies to Putin too, is that just talking about Putin's actions, decisions, policies don't actually come directly from history. Where the policies and actions come, they come from his reading of history. I mean, they come from the present and his engagement with the present. But what history does is it provides Putin with a context, and a way of conceptualizing his policies and actions, and a way of presenting those policies both to himself and to outsiders. Okay, but so it's a kind of history. You could say history is function as kind of a rationalization device, but it's the important point is it's a completely authentic rationalization device. It's not just a post hoc rationalization just to justify actions he's taken. It's a genuine set of beliefs, historical beliefs associated with the action. But here's the thing: this is the really important thing. The historical view comes into its own when it comes to the form that action, policy, and decisions take. How things are implemented in practice, right? And how the goals of action develop in the process of acting, right? Just let me give you an example of that. Okay, so I think that Putin went to war, invaded Ukraine in February 22 because he saw Ukraine and NATO's build-up of Ukraine as a strategic military threat, not necessarily an immediate one, but certainly one in the medium term. So it was a strategic calculation. That's what informs his invasion of Ukraine. But how he goes about that invasion and his subsequent actions is very much shaped by his historical perspectives, right? And particularly, of course, his historical perspective about the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians as being one people, and the whole history of Russian-Ukrainian relations. So there is this strategic decision, military operations, military expansion, there's war, but what in political terms, Putin's annexation or occupation of Ukrainian territory takes the form of incorporation into the Russian Federation. So you see what I mean? So his fundamental historical view about the nature of Russians and Ukrainians and their relationship is really fundamental in informing the content of his policy and his military goals. So that's the way I see a relationship between the role of history. It's not the reason for action, but it's crucial in shaping the character of that action.
There is something about his articles, and not just his articles, but many of his speeches, which I'm going to say straight away remind me a lot of legal briefs, that he's made a decision, he's got to explain the decision, he's got to justify the decision. So he does what lawyers do, is that he puts together the facts, the evidence that supports the decision and which defends it. And a lot of his articles, for me, actually have that defensive quality about them, that they are actually explaining his actions and defending them, and in fact putting a case. And he does this actually very well. I think that there's a lot about Putin which we don't know. I think he's done a lot more legal work, this is my own personal view, than people understand, because the way he constructs his arguments have so much of the lawyer about them. And lawyers can work with history, and there is an overlap between legal work and history, as I've seen myself many times. But of course, lawyers use history in a particular way, and I think that is to some extent what Putin does. And of course, it doesn't, because it shapes his arguments, because it presents his case in a certain way. It shapes his case, and it shapes his future decisions in exactly the way that you said.
Well, that's interesting.
I agree.
Oh.
I
I was just going to say, if you're using history to build a case, I got that impression in 2014 with his Crimean speech when they reunified or annexed, whatever language we want to use. He outlined the decision, and again, it felt like also he gave almost a warning then, because obviously taking back Crimea, they could refer to the Treaty of Pereslav from 1654. This was the 300-year anniversary in 1954 when Khrushchev handed it to Ukraine, at least administratively, and we criticized this. But what was interesting in the 2014 Crimean speech was he did mention the rest of the historical Russian lands from Odessa to Kharkov, when he essentially criticized the Bolsheviks, like, who knows why they transferred this to Ukraine. He said God will judge them. That was his words. But I see the same rhetoric coming back now. These are historical Russian lands, and it seems almost, to use your words, Alexander, he's building a legal case for suggesting, we gave you these territories with Russian peoples, Russian speakers, with Russian culture, and if your idea of a nation building or Ukrainian nationalism is anti-Russian to its core in terms of de-Russifying the language, culture, traditions, pushing all the statues into the river. If this is your nation building, then we will effectively suspend your sovereignty over these regions, and we will take them back because you abused these territories we gave to you. It almost feels this is the direction they're taking it. And again, they might have done this anyways, for security reasons or to protect the people, whatever. But either way, it seems history is being employed here to build a legal case for what's coming next, and it can't be a coincidence that all this historical reference are coming now at a time when they see Ukraine appears to be on the verge of a collapse, and the Russians are preparing a huge offensive. So
I completely agree. Can I just quickly say before Jeff speaks, which is that I want to make it very clear that when I say that Putin is to some extent constructing a case like a lawyer does, I'm not suggesting in any sense that he's not making good faith arguments. I have no doubt that when he says what he's saying, he generally believes in the strength of his arguments. Again, I have, I get that very clear sense from the way that he's doing it. But if you've practiced in courts and seen the way advocates work in courts, you often find that the most effective and powerful and reasoned advocates are those who believe their case. And I think this is very much what Putin does. And of course, the more you research your case and the more you construct it, the more carefully you construct it, the more likely you are eventually to believe it yourself.
Yes. I agree 100% that when Putin speaks, it's in good faith. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, but that's that's what he means. What he says, of course, what he says, what he means changes over time. But there's nothing exceptional about that. Yeah, and I agree with your point about the legal character of. In this case, we're talking about speeches or indeed historical essays, but a lot of things that you might attribute to its like legal character. Of course, Putin, of course, was a law student, as everyone knows. He trained as a lawyer, at least as an undergraduate. I would characterize it as narrative history. Yeah, of constructing a narrative and an associated argument in a particular way. But then I would also make the argument that there are very significant overlaps between law and history as disciplines or as academics. In fact, I wrote a paper. I'll send it to you, Alexander. You might be interested, which was called the philosophy of law and the philosophy of history, like making that comparison. But I think the other thing that strikes me, So the careful construction, the evidence-based, logic-based, narrative construction of these speeches and of these essays that he's read is a point about their authorship. Now, I'm sure that Putin, has some research system. Obviously, he's given documents. Maybe there's an input from historians or his staff, and maybe editing, maybe drafting. I don't know, but I'm absolutely convinced that this is about Putin's authorship of these essays and speeches. There might have been other inputs on, but there very definitely is. He is the author of all these statements and arguments that he makes. And in response to what you said, it'd be very interesting, won't it, to see, how this plays out. Is the history, so to speak, the historical rhetoric and discourse going to, predominate over strategic calculation? And what are going to be the consequences of either way, whether strategic calculation predominates or whether historical discourse predominates? And and I kind of at the moment my worry is that the history is going to win out, and there's going to be some very negative consequences there. Which brings me to another point. I was thinking about starting off our conversation by drawing your attention to. I haven't got a copy. I couldn't find my copy, but there was a book by a guy called David Reef, R-I-E-F-F. He's an American journalist, and he published a book in 2017 in praise of forgetting. And his basic argument is, the damage that historical memory does, because it's a distorted representation of the past, the damage that it does in the present, in terms of sparking disputes, intensifying conflict, leading to polarization of differences, all of that kind of thing. A lot of this stuff being to do with clashing nationalisms, which of course is what we've got going on in Ukraine at the moment to a certain extent. And his basic argument is that we'd be all much better off if we forgot. If we didn't have this historical memory, or there was less of it, if we forgot history, if we just concentrated on our own time, where we were, our own present, yes? We're present to ourselves and present to our time, and focus on that. Okay, so he published that book in 2017, and I was very taken by it, by his argument then. But I'm even more taken by the argument now, because I think historical memory, bad history, distorted history, polarized history, one side, however you want to label it, has actually been very, very damaging in relation to the Ukraine war. And we've been much, rather than, and also history. Actually, this is particularly true, I think, in relation to Western discussions about the war. History becomes, historical analogy or historical claims about whatever themes become a substitute for actually thinking about what's actually going on now in front of us and what might happen as a consequence of that. And I think that's kind of what's happening in relation to this developing Russian discourse about reuniting historical Russia and its peoples. It's it's the historical vision that's driving action and things forward, rather than the reality that actually that confronts Russia, the choices, the hard choices, actually that confront Russia in the present time, and the cost, the damages, the dangers. But I still have a certain degree of hope, actually quite a large degree of hope, that Putin, that Putin will resist that temptation. And actually, there's an interesting. Another point about Putin history, which I picked up on recently, which I think fits into this bit of the discussion, which was when he was at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. Yeah, remember the one where Ukraine and Georgia were going to be admitted as members in due course, right? So he was there, and he actually made a speech at the conference. And it's actually quite a moderate, mild speech, very, very different from the speech he delivered in Munich a year before, the Munich Security Conference speech. And he was very much trying to persuade his Western audience, the NATO audience, not to go down this path, that it was dangerous. It was, not just because Russia didn't like it, because of all the other consequences might flow there. That was interesting. I'd never actually read that speech or reports of it before. But also, he did a press conference, one of his press conferences in Bucharest, right? And there was a question came up. I can't remember what it exactly was. And he responded to the question by saying this. He said, "Oh, as you know, I'm very interested in history, particularly modern European history, right?" And he said, one of the people that interests me most is Bismarck. And one of the things I learned from Bismarck was it's not intentions that matter, it's capabilities. And that's my worry in relation to NATO expansion. It's not a matter of intentions, it's a matter of capabilities. And that is what my concern is. Yeah. So that was very interesting for another reason. Going back to Stalin's library, Stalin was also very, very interested in Bismarck. Bismarck, was huge. Stalin had a huge interest in Bismarck. Bismarck, of course, was a realist, pragmatic, a state builder, a unifier or an attempted unifier. All kind of things which I think I would characterize Stalin's being, and also Putin as being as well. So people often like to think of both Stalin and Putin in terms of Machiavellian terms, that kind of concept. But I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong in the case of Stalin, and I think it's wrong in the case of Putin. If there is a historical figure which which might help us try to understand what they've done and what they will do in the future, then Bismarck might be the person that we ought to focus on in that discussion.
Maybe Bismarck would be also a good person to look back on in history, because after the Cold War, when the United States and its partners were pitching the idea of unipolarity, in which there's only one center of power, it's the whole idea would be, we're liberal democracies, we're gonna be the only dominant force, but we're gonna be good. We're a force for good because we're liberal democracies. So the way the Russians have countered this over and over again is, when any country assesses threats, it has to look at two components. You look at capabilities and intentions. What will they do with these capabilities? And again, intentions change, but the capabilities remain there. So for them, it might, whenever the West talks about missile defense, like, we're going to be able to intercept nuclear retaliatory capabilities, but we have no intentions of doing it. Or we're going to expand NATO all along the Russian borders. However, we only have the best of intentions. So when you pitch unipolarity, it's always, yes, we're going to have max capabilities, but you have to trust our good intentions. So it seems quite sensible, if you want to counter the unipolar argument, to refer to Bismarck, if you will, that we will look at the capabilities, not your intentions. Are you muted, both of you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think there's another point to read here, Glenn, actually, which is that the Western intentions toward Russia have changed, and they've changed quite radically. Yes, much more hostile. Yes, and ambitious in theory anyway, than they were in 2008 when Putin was addressing them in Bucharest. Now, that change has come about for reasons which have to do with the West and the choices that it made, but also, it's also come about in response to Putin's actions. Putin's militarization of his diplomacy by invading Ukraine. So there is an element of self-fulfilling prophecy involved here, because one of the rationalizations that Putin has made for taking this, what I call a preventative war against Ukraine, is because he said Western, what they want to do, they want to break up Russia, they want to split Russia up, they want to destroy Russia as a great power. And I think there was a certain amount, there was and is a certain amount of truth in that. But nevertheless, Putin's own action, his own response to it, has actually made it even more true than it was in the past.
It's very, going back to what you said about Bismarck, very, very interesting. I didn't know that he had that. He'd made that comment about Bismarck. Because the most interesting thing about Bismarck, to me, is that Bismarck always knew when to stop. This is one. I mean, he didn't march on Vienna, for example. I mean, he had enormous pressure, when they won the battle against the Austrians, to march on Vienna. And he said, no, we are not going to march on Vienna. This is going to be a huge mistake. If we march on Vienna, we're going to take on far more than we can. And perhaps if he remembers his Bismarck, maybe that will tell him when to stop in terms of Ukraine as well. Maybe just as Bismarck realized that, marching on Vienna was not a good idea, maybe he'll realize that marching on Kiev or Odessa isn't such a good idea either. Just throwing that out, because I would say this, I am frankly becoming concerned at some of the statements that are coming out of Moscow now. All kinds of officials at various levels are talking increasingly about in terms of total victory. And I don't think that they have worked through exactly what that means. Firstly, whether it is achievable at all, and if it is achievable, whether in fact it is actually going to work out in the end to anybody's benefit, including Russia's. I mean, I could see enormous economic problems. I could see huge problems with people in Ukraine as well. The relationship between Russia and Europe going forward, it would be even more damaged than it is at the moment. And your point about perspective in the global south, I think, is absolutely right. Bismarck always knew how far to go, and he stopped. And I wonder whether Putin will do the same.
I think yes, I hope, I suspect, and actually I think he does. I think he does know when to stop. And I think he's shown that, by the way. He's resisting this tremendous pressure he's under to commit himself explicitly to expansive territorial goals in relation to Ukraine. And the thing I remember, I did a piece on this myself about Putin's territorial ambitions, how far we go. And the thing that where that piece started was when I was at the Valdai conference meeting in Sochi in October. So I was in the room for Putin's famous annual press conference. And it was an amazing experience, and quite frankly, an amazing performance by Putin. But one of the things he said, he was asked a direct question. Well, in fact, virtually a direct in your face question: are you going to take Odessa? Because Odessa, after all, is a Russian city. So, are you going to take it? Put your money on the table on this one, right? And his response was, he said, it's not a matter of territory; it's a matter of security. And I would do whatever's necessary for the purposes of Russian security, not just the security of the Russian state, but also the security of our compatriots living in Ukraine. So I think he's kind of like, and that I think he's still holding to that position, and that gives me hope that going forward, even if there is a big time Ukrainian military collapse, or even if there isn't, that Putin actually has all the way through the war. By the way, well, before the war, for many years since 2014, but all the way through the war, he has acted with restraint. And is he really going to start behaving, differently? I hope not.
I think his caution is or worries about rhetorically box himself in, because if he's promising to deliver Odessa now, he's tying his own hands in terms of future diplomacy. Because again, I believe he's authentic in this argument, because he's the main concern of Russia would be, of course, that NATO would move into Ukraine and threaten its security, as well as, of course, oppressing the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So again, much like the Americans wouldn't want the Russian troops in Mexico, but I guess from their perspective, if they could negotiate a way of having Ukraine to be neutral, such as they wanted before 2014, or the Minsk agreement, which they failed to have implemented up to 2022, then through that argument of Putin, then they wouldn't need Odessa. Then it would simply because it wouldn't be a threat to Russia. So I think as the signals have moved forwards, and the war seems to be coming to an end in the foreseeable future, and what he's hearing from NATO is, listen, when this war is over, then we're gonna let Ukraine in. If this rhetoric continues, then obviously there's no settlement afterwards. So I think that not promising to deliver Odessa now gives him the freedom to negotiate something of a neutral position for Ukraine. However, if NATO doesn't give him neutrality for Ukraine, then he can't accept Odessa becoming NATO territory. So in that instance, I think he will take Odessa. But again, I think one of the problems, I think, of the Ukrainian side has been they locked themselves in. Zelensky effectively said, it's illegal for me to negotiate with Russia. We're not going to stop until we have Crimea. If you set this, if you already set the objectives and you have left yourself with no room for maneuver, you boxed yourself in. So I think if there will be any diplomacy or possibility of it later on, it's good probably not to say things too certain, because I heard that question in Valdai as well. But actually, the year before, when Valdai was in Moscow last year, sorry, that's 2 years from now. We just had New Year's Eve. A journalist asked the same question. He said, "I want to visit Odessa next year. Will I require a Russian or Ukrainian visa?" And he gave a similar answer. It's not territory. We have to wait and see. We want our security one way or the other. So I think that would be his logic behind it. Though.
Yeah, I think as far as I can say, everyone has boxed themselves in. The Ukrainians, the West, everyone's boxed himself in except Putin. Yeah, but he can't get out. He can't get out of the situation on his own. Yeah, it will require there'll be some significant movement on the Ukrainian side and on the Western side. And if that doesn't happen, then then I think the Russian nationalist dreams of getting to Odessa and even capturing Kiev, Kharkov, all of that. I think those dreams might be realized in some form. But we'll see.
I think that is a very important point, because, of course, it's a point in some ways that we've been. I think three of us have been making at various times, that the absence of diplomacy is very dangerous. It is actually leading to outcomes which potentially are in nobody's interests, and certainly not in the interests of anybody who cares or say they care for Ukraine itself. I mean, I think that's my last point on this.
I'll make a last point. Yeah. The big loser in all this. Okay, whatever difficulties Russia might have whatever path it chooses, whatever like crisis the outcome might provoke in the West. The big loser of this is going to be Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. That's going to be the greatest tragedy of this situation, whatever the outcome.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think, yeah, this is often we tend to, at least in the West, ignore the the problems within Ukraine. Of course, not only the Russian invasion and yeah, the horrible consequences it has had for the Ukrainian people, but also the internal dynamic. Because again, Ukraine was not at peace between 2014 and 22, and I guess, yeah, just my final comment, I guess, would be my concern a bit about the direction of the historical narratives we have in the West, because after the Cold War, yes, we with the objective of creating a Europe without Russia, I think we began to construct these historical narratives. For example, Russia was a cause of the Second World War rather than the one who defeated Hitler. We said the Cold War ended through victory, so not through a compromise, in order to delegitimize the idea of having a unified or inclusive European security architecture. So we have all these narratives, but they weren't really anti or that Russian or this hostile to its core. But I think that once we began to have this conflict over Ukraine, especially since 2014, I think we began to adapt a lot of the language of the nationalists in Ukraine. So now, I see Western leaders more or less defending Bandera. It's like, oh yeah, Azov. Yeah, it's just, well, are they really Nazis? Well, or as they said in Canada, some Nazis, they were just fighting for their country. So suddenly we're getting to change the narrative. I saw former Swedish Prime Minister Schmidt. He went out and Carl Schmidt. No, sorry, I forget his name. Anyways, he posted on Twitter a picture of Ukrainian knights fighting orcs, which is again pitched back to this Kievan Rus idea that these are the white Europeans fighting the Asiatic barbarians, and so we're starting to go into a very ugly territory in which I think the idea of supporting Ukrainian nationalists to create a Ukraine without Russia, de-Russifying Ukraine, this fits within our vision of a Europe without Russia. But nonetheless, I think the narratives we're embracing now, it's going a very ugly direction. And of course, the Russians will see a way of countering this with narratives of their own, which might increasingly seem to delegitimize the entire notion of Ukrainian statehood altogether. If this is how we define Ukraine now, as being an anti-Russian entity, one where again, there was Americans who passed a resolution where they called the famine of Holodomor deliberate Russian genocide. I mean, this is incredible stuff, which really fuels a lot of resentment. Now, if this is the path we're going down, I don't think Russia can live next to such a Ukraine, and in which they would see the need to effectively dismantle it, or at least take much more territory and even regime change. So, this is my greatest concern. I think, yes, both of you suggested, all the people are suggesting, we're supporting Ukraine, we're supporting Ukraine. What we're really doing is, pushing them down the river and just setting a horrible, horrible future awaiting for them. Anyways, any final comments before we round this off? No? Okay. Well, then I'll just want to, thank you again, Professor Roberts, for your time. And we hope to have you back again sometime.
Cool.